There are names in Scotland that survived famine, clearance, and exile, and still, no one could say for certain where they began. For centuries, a surname was treated as an answer. It told you your clan, your glen, your loyalty, your blood. A MacLeod was a MacLeod. A Fraser was a Fraser. The name was the story, and the story was considered closed. Then geneticists started reading something older than any clan record. They started reading the genome itself. And for a small group of rare Highland surnames, names that barely survive today, carried by a few thousand people scattered across Scotland, Canada, and the Appalachian Hills, the DNA did not simply confirm what the tartans and the family trees had always claimed. It complicated it. In some cases, it rewrote it entirely. This is the story of what happened when science finally looked underneath the names. For most of Scottish history, a surname was not just identification. In the Highlands especially, it was a declaration of belonging. Clan systems were built on the idea of shared descent, a single founding ancestor, branching outward into septs and cadet families, all bound by blood and by land. Historians and genealogists built entire frameworks around this assumption. If your name was Gunn, you were presumed descended from the Norse Gaelic lords of Caithness. If your name was Chisholm, your roots were traced to Norman settlers who arrived with William the Conqueror's distant successors and gradually became Highland. If your name was MacFarlane, the story pointed to the wild shores of Loch Lomond, a clan forged in isolation. These origin stories were not careless. They were built from charters, from church records, from oral tradition passed down with real care across generations. For a long time, that was the best evidence anyone had. The name, the land, and the legend lined up neatly enough that nobody felt the need to look deeper. The assumption seemed reasonable, because for centuries, nothing contradicted it. But there were small things. Quiet things. The kind of detail that genealogists noticed and then explained away. Some rare surname clusters showed up in regions where the clan's recorded history said they shouldn't be. A handful of Gunn family lines, for instance, carried oral traditions hinting at origins further north and east than Caithness, toward Scandinavia, almost too far to take seriously. Some Chisholm lines preserved fragments of tradition that didn't match the tidy Norman arrival story at all, pointing instead to something older, something already present in the glens before the recorded settlers ever came. Parish records added their own static. Spelling variants, broken lineages, sons recorded under their mother's name after a father's early death or disappearance, small disruptions that genealogists patched over because paper records, however careful, were never complete. None of this broke the official story, but it left cracks. And cracks, eventually, get tested. That test arrived in the form of DNA. Genetic genealogy works by reading 3 different kinds of inheritance. The Y chromosome passes almost unchanged from father to son, preserving a direct paternal line stretching back hundreds, sometimes thousands of years, which made it the obvious tool for surname research, since in most cultures, names and Y chromosomes travel down the same path. Mitochondrial DNA passes from mother to child, tracing the maternal line instead, often telling a very different story than the surname does. And autosomal DNA, inherited from both parents in a shuffled mix, reveals the broader genetic landscape, every ancestral population that contributed to a person, not just the line carrying the name. For Highland surname projects, researchers began collecting Y chromosome samples from men sharing the same rare surname, hoping to confirm a single founding ancestor for each clan. It seemed like it would be straightforward confirmation. A formality. It was not. What the Y-DNA revealed was not one ancestor per surname. In several of the rarest Highland names, researchers found something stranger. Multiple, genetically distinct paternal lineages, all carrying the exact same surname, with no common ancestor anywhere within a genealogically meaningful time frame. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. The story did not collapse. It widened. For names like Gunn, Y-DNA testing uncovered at least 2 separate genetic lineages, unrelated to each other for thousands of years, both carrying the surname with equal historical legitimacy. One lineage showed strong affinities to populations from Norway and the Northern Isles, consistent, researchers suggested, with the long Norse presence in Caithness and Sutherland. But a second lineage showed a genetic signature far more aligned with older, pre-Norse populations already rooted in northern Scotland, the kind of ancestry that predates any Viking longship by thousands of years. If you're interested in stories where the evidence quietly rewrites the map, this is exactly the kind of mystery worth following, and subscribing means you won't miss the next one. What this meant was unsettling in a quiet way. The Gunn surname was never one bloodline pretending to be unified. It was, the data suggested, multiple separate origins that converged on the same name, possibly through a powerful founding figure whose name was adopted by allied or absorbed families, possibly through coincidence, possibly through something closer to political alliance than blood relation at all. Researchers proposed several explanatory frameworks, none of them mutually exclusive, none of them fully proven. The first was straightforward admixture, Norse settlers intermarrying with existing Pictish and Gaelic populations over generations, blending lineages so thoroughly that genetic and cultural identities stopped lining up cleanly. The second was the ghost population idea, the suggestion that some of these genetic signatures trace back to a population not well represented in any historical record at all, an earlier layer of Highland ancestry that left no name, no chronicle, only a genetic echo carried forward by chance through families that later adopted clan names for reasons of loyalty, protection, or convenience rather than shared blood. The third was cultural absorption without genetic replacement, the idea that being Gunn, or Chisholm, or McFarlane was, in practice, often a political and territorial identity rather than a strictly biological one. Smaller family groups, displaced by feud or famine or simple survival, may have taken shelter under a stronger clan's name and protection, becoming Gunns or Chisholms in every sense except ancestry. None of these explanations alone resolved the mystery. Together, they suggested something larger, that the clan system, for all its emphasis on blood, may have functioned as much through alliance and adoption as through descent. The most significant evidence came from a broader academic effort, large-scale population genetics studies comparing Highland surname clusters against ancient DNA recovered from Iron Age and early medieval burial sites across Scotland and Scandinavia. Unlike earlier surname projects, which worked with small living samples, these studies incorporated ancient genomes directly, allowing researchers to compare living Highland lineages against the actual DNA of people who lived in the region 1,000 years before any surname existed. This was the turning point. Earlier studies could only infer. This comparison could test directly against the deep past. And the results, researchers noted cautiously, complicated the picture further rather than resolving it. Several rare surname lineages, including branches of Macaulay, Chisholm, and MacNeil, showed genetic continuity with pre-Norse, pre-Gaelic populations stretching back further than any clan origin story accounted for. Not new arrivals. Not even Gaelic settlers in the conventional sense. Survivors of a much older Highland population, one that predates the entire framework of clan history as it's usually told. Here is the twist that researchers kept circling back to, carefully, without overclaiming. It was not that these families had Norse blood, or Gaelic blood, or Norman blood, though many carried fragments of all three. The surprise was that buried beneath the layers everyone expected, certain lineages preserved a genetic signal connecting back to populations who occupied the Highlands before the Gaels themselves arrived from Ireland. Fragments of the original post-Ice Age settlers of Scotland, present in trace amounts in living people who, for 1,000 years, never knew their name carried something that old. The genome was not erasing the clan story. It was revealing an older one underneath it. This matters beyond genealogy hobbyists and rare surname enthusiasts, because it points to something true about human history in general. Populations are not pure streams flowing cleanly from a single source. They are deltas, branching, merging, absorbing, separating, and rejoining across thousands of years. The neat idea of one founder, one bloodline, one unbroken line to a single ancestor, is almost always a simplification that paper records encouraged and DNA quietly dismantles. A surname, it turns out, is a record of culture far more reliably than it is a record of biology. People take names through marriage, through fosterage, through political submission, through simple survival. The name endures. The blood beneath it shifts and recombines in ways no document ever captured. Picture the land itself for a moment. The single-track roads winding through Sutherland and Caithness, where the gunlands once stood. Heather rolling over low hills toward a coastline the color of iron. Sea locks cutting deep into the interior, carrying Norse longships 1,000 years ago and carrying, in the silt beneath,
traces of people who were already old here before the Vikings ever arrived. Stone circles standing in fields that have been farmed and fought over for 4,000 years, indifferent to whichever name currently claims the ground. It is easy to forget, looking at a modern surname on a census form, that it sits on top of all of that. Layers of arrival, conflict, marriage, and quiet continuation, compressed into a few syllables passed from father to son without anyone fully understanding what they were carrying forward. If you carry one of these rare Highland names, the science suggests your story was never as simple as the clan origin myth implied. It was something more remarkable. Multiple human stories, sometimes separated by thousands of years and thousands of miles, converging on a single name, a single identity, a single sense of belonging, built not on a clean bloodline but on something closer to chosen kinship, reinforced over centuries until it became indistinguishable from blood itself. The old story said, one ancestor, one line, one truth. The genome says something more honest and more human. Identity was never that simple, not in the Highlands, and not anywhere people have ever lived close enough together to need each other's protection. Scientists remain cautious about drawing firm conclusions from limited ancient samples, and Highland population genetics is still an active, evolving field. But the early evidence is consistent enough to suggest the clan map taught for generations was a useful simplification, not a falsehood, but an incomplete sketch of something far older and more tangled. The names survive. Gunn, Chisholm, McFarland, Macaulay, McNeil, carried now by descendants scattered from the Highlands to Nova Scotia to the Carolinas, still gathering at clan events, still wearing tartans assigned to a single unified ancestry that, the DNA suggests, may never have fully existed in the way the legend claimed. And maybe that is not a loss. Maybe it is something better. Not one bloodline defending its territory across the centuries, but many different peoples, many different origins, choosing again and again to become one family under a single name, until the choosing itself became the truth worth keeping. The map of the Highlands was never finished. It is still being redrawn one genome at a time, by names that refuse to disappear and DNA that refuse to stay silent. If this is the kind of hidden history that keeps you curious, subscribe. There are more names, more genomes, and more forgotten stories still waiting underneath the surface of who we think we are.